Now that we've finished our questions, I'd like to introduce Patty Cassidy, Senior Consultant with Griffin, Hammis & Associates, who will be presenting today. Patty?
Hello, thank you very much. Is everyone able to hear me? Good. I'm hearing a few people answer. That's great. Thank you all for having me. Again, my name is Patty Cassidy, and I'm with Griffin, Hammis & Associates. We are a full-service consulting firm that specializes in employment for people with the most significant disabilities, particularly in areas of customized employment and self-employment. So would like to spend a little time today sharing with you some of what we've learned, but also give you some tools that will hopefully be helpful to you if you are working in a rural community and responsible for assisting individuals with significant disabilities in employment. Of course, these tools and techniques also work for people that may have less significant challenges or complexities in their lives. But we believe that some of these strategies really hold true for anybody who seeks employment in community areas where it appears to be less opportunity for employment. So let's look a little bit at some of the handouts that we have here today. You're going to find at the bottom of the screen some files to download. There's the handouts for today under Rural Job Development Check and Connect. I think I just hit the play button, so it's the PowerPoint is flying down the screen. Hold on just a second. So we have the handouts, which is the Rural Job Development Check and Connect. There is an article on customizing rural job development, a little bit more lengthy document that I hope that you'll take some time to look through. They'll give you some more detail around some of the strategies that you might wish to employ. And then there are two briefs that are brief. They are one on resource ownership, which we'll talk a bit about today, and then the other one is on self-employment. And these are techniques and tools that have been very effective in areas where there is less opportunity for wage employment than you might find in larger communities where there are more employers. So we're going to spend some time today kind of thinking through what strategies you might wish to employ. Some of you might have participated in the session I did a couple of weeks ago on discovery, and you'll see some of the similar issues that we've discussed around those factors that impact employment for people with disabilities, particularly in rural communities. Of course, most rural communities are small, have limited employers in the area. There are multiple people competing for the same jobs that might come open. And so we find that there's less opportunity for employment options from which to choose or from which we can select or negotiate positions for individuals. One of the primary issues I think most people have found that has impacted them is the issue of transportation, looking for ways and means in which people who live in rural communities Okay, I'm going to continue. If someone can tell me that we're okay, that would be great. If not, I will continue.
Patty, we can hear you loud and clear. Thanks so much for troubleshooting that.
Wonderful, thank you. So sorry. So I think we were just discussing some of the issues on the slide that's currently on your screen, talking about lack of trained staff in community rehabilitation and school programs that may have some additional training around rural issues. And then another issue that we have faced, and again, I have not worked in Indiana in a number of years, although I used to be a provider there in some of the rural counties outside of Indianapolis. But what we've often found through our work at Griffin Hammis is that sometimes the funding is either inadequate or it might be misdirected to other kinds of community employment programs that don't have the outcome of an individualized employment option for somebody. They're more of a servicing model. So we find that sometimes the actual impact of employment is because the funding has not been directed to the placement and support and creation of employment for individual folks. So these are some of the issues that I think I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. So I think that one of the things that we've learned about is that sometimes some of the strategies we've used when we continue to try to employ traditional labor market approaches to employment is that we can continue to use those same approaches, but the issues are still going to remain the same. We'll have a limited number of employers. Employers only have a limited number of employment openings for individuals, and that there's competition for those jobs. So we really need to think about some alternative strategies, and this is some of the work that we do, and certainly hope that you all are learning along with us some of these approaches, such as an economic development approach to employment development. We will be talking a brief bit about that today, and you'll find more of that information in the articles that we have for you to download. We also talk a lot about the functional assessments of getting to know people right inside their communities, where it makes sense that people are learning a bit about themselves, and that we get to know the individuals as employment staff through that process of discovery that we're using in Indiana now. Also, that we have to really be competent and have quality worksite instruction and consultation and support strategies, rather than stepping in and assuming the supervision and management of individual job seekers, or at that time employees, that we really have perfected our consultative roles. The other issues that I think would certainly impact employment of people is the use of Social Security work incentives, and being very, very familiar not only with what they are, but how they can be used in the process of employment development. That really having the knowledge of how to use resources to create employment opportunities is a really powerful strategy and knowledge to have. And of course, lastly, is just the concept of self-determination, and individuals with disabilities having the opportunity to direct their employment and to learn alongside a job developer, job staff, and employees to be able to make some selections about what work might look like for that individual. So as we think through some of these things, we've got to look at, are we really developing jobs? You know, when we talk about employment development, job development, are we really truly creating employment, or are we just going out trying to find jobs that we might fit people into? And I think that, you know, we can all take these kind of questions that help us grow in our professional role and think about, do we really help people get around that being compared to other applicants through that competitive hiring process, what we would typically think of as the labor market approach? When individuals who have limited experiences, or individuals who have had no work history, no work experience, come to be compared in a competitive process, we find that people often fail. They lack that competitive edge and are not chosen for the job. Many times we are better at helping people who have less significant challenges, but those individuals who have higher complex support needs are folks that we really need to think through about how we help meet their needs for community-based employment in creative ways. And are we really looking at the natural relationships, the ways in which our community puzzle pieces get put together through connections and relationships? Do we use those, and are we helping to provide supports and training based on what is natural and typical in our communities? And then lastly, are we really using our discovery process to help guide and even begin the process of job development through informational interviews? Or do we create an employment plan and look at discovery as a means to get to the next step in the process? Are we really using that discovery to help meet those needs? So let's move on a little bit and think about what we might want to look at in terms of that economic development model. I think that community exploration is really critical. We spend a lot of time now with good discovery practices of getting to know the job seeker, and yet we often don't spend the same amount of time, nor do we have that kind of relationship and social connections with other business owners in our community. And that rural economic development model is really getting to know our community, not from a standpoint of understanding only needs, but getting to know people really well in a community so that we can help negotiate employment opportunities. And we'll talk a bit here in a second about that job negotiation, but it's not just simply trying to fill a position in rural communities, because if we continue that model, we'll continue to have the lack of successes that we've seen. So we've got to change our approach. This economic development model uses social capital. It uses the kind of connections that we have through our families and friends, through the connections that our organization provides, through people who are committed and are concerned about the citizens that your agency may support. But it also talks about how we can approach different connections in the community to explore ideas and thoughts, not just looking for an open position. So an economic development model says this is much more than just a wage job. This is about a competitive employment model that helps individuals find a job in which we can provide some kind of negotiated arrangement. And that could either be a task negotiation in terms of job carving or job creation. It could be resource ownership. It could be unbundling of tasks and rebundling them into something that creates a position that helps an employer increase profitability. And it can also include self-employment or micro-enterprise development. Any of these strategies are economic development approaches because they assist a local community in growing a business, whether it's a new business or it's growing an existing business. And in many cases, these can be combined in a variety of ways to put together maybe a couple of jobs for individuals that might meet their needs or needs for support for that individual. So I think that one of the things we have to really consider is that we can't look at just one source of funding to provide supports. And I think in the context of how we have to look at employment differently, how we need to develop employment differently, we need to think about all of the potential partners, not only vocational rehabilitation or the Medicaid funding that we receive from a developmental disability system or a mental health system, but also look at the other community partners in terms of one-stop career centers through Work One in Indiana, or entrepreneurship development centers, or small business development centers. I think we need to look at opportunities through businesses and churches, ways in which we can come together and braid funding and resources, not only for you as an agency in terms of paying for a job coach or paying for job developers, but also the funds that are necessary to assist the job seeker with their employment in terms of purchasing of equipment and materials and tools, or additional training, or the help with starting up a small micro-enterprise or small business development processes. So thinking about how we can tap into those community resources is another component of good practices. So there's three pieces to this methodology, and of course you are all very familiar with these since we've been talking about this for some time, but obviously a good discovery practice, really getting to know the job seeker in a person-centered way, understanding that the assessments that we utilize are community-based, they're based on the specific job seeker's interest and skills and tasks and talents and preferences and support needs, and it does not come from already existing assessment sites. That discovery is very person-centered. Secondly, that we look at those vocational themes where we create broad themes in which we can look at where businesses where tasks that the individual could perform would be utilized. So all those kinds of connections and social capital help us to obtain that entree into businesses. And the vocational themes is one means in which we can create a path from good discovery to employment development. And then lastly, the last piece to this really critical methodology is looking at the job negotiation, ensuring that that we really are looking at the job seeker's interests and preferences and conditions of employment, but also at the same time the employer and the community, to making sure that they are well matched and that we have good consideration for the business culture and that there is something to negotiate in terms of meeting the needs of the job seeker, but at the same time for the employer, in other words, to generate profitability within the business, or that the community is in need of a product or a service that the job seeker has to offer. So there are 4 strategies that we're going to touch on today. These are the ones that we're going to be talking about that are especially effective in rural communities, but they're also extremely important in any aspect of assisting people with significant challenges. So we'll go through each one of these one at a time. The first one we're going to be discussing is the focus on small businesses. I think that the process that we employ through Griffin Hammes is that we really try to, as much as possible, look towards small business owners as our initial concepts and, initial contacts when we start with informational interviews. Small businesses are usually much more accessible, particularly in rural communities. The business owner or the manager of the company is usually in control of hiring and the decision making. You're making contact with the person who actually has that ability to do that hire. They can also be much more creative and flexible, whereas in a corporate situation, we usually have a kind of a rigid hierarchy, and we have human resources that might be the gatekeeper. We may find that in a corporate setting, we may find that job descriptions are how they recruit, hire, and train individuals, and does not allow too much creativity in job negotiation or job carving. Certainly, corporations are very familiar with accommodations, but not so much with some of the strategies around creation of employment opportunity. A small business owner generally has a great interest in their own community, and they really want to make sure that the community thrives, and they're really committed to doing what's right in terms of looking for ways in which they want to grow their business, but also to share that growth with others. They tend to be a little bit less bureaucratic, and so as compared to a corporate situation. So the pre-hiring processes of corporations often prevent individuals from accessing even the opportunity for an interview. And so we find that if we go through the small business route by contacting the small businesses, which small communities are typically pretty much more rich with those small businesses than they are with larger businesses, that we have a better footing in the process. We also want to consider really relying on our existing networks. And what I mean by that is not our traditional, we have 6 job sites that we rotate people through, but more along the lines of looking at the social capital that we already have in terms of our connections with existing employers, with our own family and friends, the businesses that we might spend time using their services or products, and then really trying to build upon those connections along with the people who are connected to our organizations that have a passionate commitment to seeing the success of our organizations, and changing that from maybe donations to having people use their own social connections to help us. I guess what we're really talking about is that kind of the process of really getting people to speak up for you, to get you a chance to get in the door by vouching for who you are. In our last session together, we talked about the Community Action Team, the CAT. It's just an approach that is a little different from a traditional employment development or business leadership network or employment development council, where a community action team, although it is focused on employment and employment outcomes, we really want those individuals to meet the job seekers and to help leverage their connections to the community to support individual job seekers. I find that in rural communities, this network of relationships is one of the most critical pieces, in that standing behind a job title as job developer, or wearing a job developer hat, I guess I would say, is not as successful in a rural community as it is to use our social connections. So I think that that's an important piece. And third is to understand that this economic development approach is really critical to local small communities. This economic development approach has to be done through negotiation, and it is to help a business grow. And in order to do that, you have to get to know them, and you have to spend time with them, and you have to spend time just as we did during discovery, of getting to know people in a very personal way. A business is not going to share exactly what their bottom line is and where they have weaknesses to someone that they don't know well. So they have to have a sense of trust and believe in your competence in order to share that with you. So we need to have opportunities for development of relationships with business people, the business owners in our community, to create that negotiated opportunity. We have to be aware that many of the job seekers that we work with can capture resources to help them with their employment development that some of us who do not have disabilities would not have available to them. And these resources, and I'll give you some examples here in a few minutes of how to use those, is not just for self-employment, but can also be used for resource ownership. And these would include funding available from Vocational Rehabilitation, which we're all very familiar with, through the Plans to Achieve Self-Support, which is a work incentive through the Social Security Administration, a PASS. We could also see the use of individual development accounts, IDAs, to assist someone with their employment development by saving $1 and obtaining sometimes $2 and even $3 for every $1 saved. There are revolving loan funds. There are all kinds of ways in which people with disabilities can actually capture some resources that can enable them to use those in terms of providing a launching pad for some economic development approaches to employment. We have to be able to explain to an employer that there is a way to help them save money, and that they have to see that there's profitability in the process of employing people. We can't just use a generic, this will be profitable for you if you hire someone. We have to be able to explain to that individual employer, that a business owner, how it will be profitable, and that comes from a conversation. So let's talk a little bit more about how some of those things might be useful. So here are some of the ideas that I want to share with you. In terms of good discovery practices, I think that we have seen some wonderful changes in the state of Indiana in terms of creating a wonderful discovery process, but we cannot get to know people on a personal basis and spend really good discovery, creating person-centered plans for individual, and then take off that really good discovery hat, throw it on the ground, and pick up our job development hat from our traditional practices and go out and start employing the same way that we have contacted businesses in the past. We really see that good discovery has an accompanying set of good job development practices, and that start of that is always the informational interview. It is the same tool that we used in discovery, and in job development we use the same tool, but we start to build upon that relationship that we start with during the discovery practice. So we want to share with you a few ideas and stories of how this has happened in our work. There are a full range of employment possibilities that we have to think about in terms of rural areas where a limited number of wage employment opportunities exist. There are a number of different ways in which we can negotiate jobs, and these would be typically wage paid, salaried or hourly paid wage jobs. We can either help create positions out of unmet needs where an employer or business owner has particular tasks that need to be accomplished but often get set aside because they are not at the moment priority, but they are critical to the function of their business, and we can help explain and show how creating a position would actually save money or make things move more smoothly, only if it's true, of course, but we have to spend time to get to know that. We can carve positions, which is taking out the tasks that someone might not be able to do well, but trading in for tasks that the person can do well, and to show where that can actually release others to do more complex tasks or positions or tasks that generate more profit. So there's all kinds of ways that that can be done. We've also used the terms restructured, unbundling, and then rebundling. I think many of you are probably familiar with that negotiated practice. The second process that we use is called resource ownership, and this is where an individual would bring some type of training, equipment, material, any kind of resource that would generate profitability for the employer that the individual uses as their main focus of their job. This has been a way for those resources that I mentioned earlier, the different kinds of funding streams that would be of great benefit to an employer, where the individual job seeker has some of those resources available to them for purchase. So I'll give you an example in a second. And then lastly is that self-employment or micro-enterprise, where an individual can start a business that provides either a product or a service that the community needs. And it's not something that would be created for them, but it must be something that it derives from the discovery process, that it is unique to that individual, and that it is something that the person is able to complete and something a person is willing and wanting to do, and that also will generate a profit. But always in this process of employment, that it must be paid and competitive work. It always must be in an integrated setting, and that we have to assume that for many of the folks, it would require some type of ongoing support. And if their supports are not available, then some of these models may not be as feasible, and that needs to be part of the feasibility process, is to determine the amount of support someone has available to them. So let's talk about an example. This was a woman who lives in Florida, who one of my colleagues had worked with, who spent some time looking for jobs related to caring for animals. She had several vocational themes, but her employment came about through this particular theme, where a wage job was found that paid wages based on the resource that she brought to the center. Connections were made with an educational and rehabilitation center for wild animals in a rural area. An informational interview, a really good informational interview, delved into what kind of tasks do people do and what is the need for the kinds of skills and tasks that this young lady brought to the job. And the wildlife rehabilitators were actually taking turns cutting vegetables that would take up to 8 hours per day. So between the three of them, they would each pitch in 2.5 hours where their skilled animal managers were cutting vegetables. So the resource that was brought to the job and the conversation that was brought to them was, would it be possible for this young woman to bring a piece of equipment, a tool, which is a Hobart cutter. Some of you might be familiar with seeing those from restaurants, and that she would be able to do the same kind of work by cutting those vegetables, relieving those wildlife rehabilitation specialists to manage the animals and to do the things that they were trained to do. And at the same time, she could do that work for up to 4 hours per day using the cutter. And so they created an opportunity for her to be paid wages for her time there, and then she was doing that work for 4 hours a day during the week. So resource ownership is something that we use sparingly and only when it's based on the individual job seeker. We do not go at it with thinking that this is an opportunity for us to create a position, buying a job. We do not want to lead with the opportunity that you could have a piece of equipment. The job seeker has to contribute a resource that actually increases the business profitability. It could be training. One gentleman was able to bring a resource of being a barista. He went and got barista training, and with that training and certificate, he was able to perform the functions of a job. So it could be training, it could be a vehicle, it could be tools, it could be anything that would help to contribute profitability to the business. We also want to make sure that the resource ownership helps to create a job for the job seeker, but also in almost all cases it enhances some kind of workplace prestige, that the individual is bringing something of value to the employment setting. And that it also helps, again, to support that economic development, that community development, and that the employer or the business is actually gaining from that piece of equipment, and that the residual of those profits results in the individual's wages. So remember that in resource ownership, that discovery is always the foundation. It is not the need of an employer, always, and it is not the need of an idea for a business that someone has. It has to be based upon the discovery process and the ideal conditions for employment. It's usually generated from those informational interviews, that emerging connection and relationship that we see happen through the discovery process and through informational interviews. But it is never the first strategy in job development. The article that we have will give you a few more examples of those and some of the cautions that we have to offer you in terms of not seeing people use this tool quickly and to become a source of business funds for local employers. We want to be very careful and cautious, but it is an amazing opportunity that can create employment for people. Resource ownership is really a great opportunity for people to have higher status within the business. We want to make sure that there's a good ecological match both for the person with the disability and the economic opportunity that it creates. But we also want to make sure that wages that are paid for the individual who's using that equipment or who brings that education or training must be commensurate with people who have similar positions. So there is some negotiation involved with that process. Another example is a gentleman that actually had several different types of employment within one business. This is Corey, who worked in Toccoa, Georgia, which is a rural mountain community in the Appalachian Mountains of Georgia. He had been an employee of Rose Blaine's, was doing some janitorial work, cleanup, and he needed more hours. And when speaking with the business owner, she mentioned that there was not a lot of growth in her business, that there was actually not a lot of people coming in. She wished that she had some games. She wished she could videotape kids' parties, that she might be able to generate some more income. So with that, Corey again had a great interest in using video games. As a video arcade owner, he purchased a couple of video games. He purchased a video camera and a screen so that as people would have a party, he could have the party being videotaped and then being displayed across the screen while kids were playing. He was great. He really had learned a great amount about video games. He was learning some things about repair that he was getting from the owners of the providers of the equipment. He bought Dance Revolution. He bought Skee Ball. And then so he had three different ways in which he earned income. One was he had a wage job. He did still maintain his job doing some janitorial and cleaning work. Secondly, he earned income from his games. He paid a small amount to the owner of the bowling alley for the electricity that his games used, but he received all of the profits from those pieces of equipment. And then the third thing is that he earned a small share of the income from the use of his video machine that he taped parties, and from the use of that equipment. So he had three different ways in which he could to earn income. But what we see here is that was mutual benefit. This was an opportunity for the employer to have some additional customers for their business, that it brought people into the business, that it brought new people into the business, and as the owner said, sometimes people even break down and bowl a game or two, but they had a new set of young people coming into the facility to play video games. So it's just an opportunity for creation that didn't go in with, I want to own a video game store, or I wanted to bring that. It was actually a need that the employer had. So what this gentleman got was he got some skills training from the supplier. He brought a knowledge of games to the owner, to the bowling alley owner, and he had new machines that were added to inventory. And as a matter of fact, he ended up purchasing several additional games to bring to the facility. Funding sources came from the vocational rehabilitation purchases. There was also a customized employment project that helped with assistance of that. The community rehab program assisted with a small amount of funds. And we mentioned earlier about having revolving loan funds. And for some agencies we've seen around the country have established small microloan programs where the agency would have, say, $4,000 or $5,000 in an account. They would be able to offer a small microloan to an individual, maybe of several $100s up to $1,000. The individual would pay that back after earnings begin on their small business or their earnings from resource ownership, and with a very low amount or no interest, the individual could pay that back. So some community rehab programs have established revolving loan funds that could benefit someone similarly to Corey. So some of the benefits of self-employment is that it's really flexible. An individual can have the help in growing a business specifically around that person, their own needs. Maybe it's around availability of hours, the flexibility that's needed for some people that struggle with morning hours or struggle with social engagements, things that can allow the person to create work around themselves. It's really a unique way to help people who get Social Security to use their benefits in a way that can be used to help create an employment opportunity instead of just relying on an employment job developer. Social Security work incentives are very powerful tools. The last to think about is that there is a job scarcity in rural communities. There is a tight labor market. And self-employment can create opportunities for people where we might not have seen them exist otherwise. And lastly, and for those of you who are familiar with the Social Security and Medicaid issues, that people can only hold maybe $2,000 in assets. And with self-employment, an individual can have unlimited resources in their business account that could later be used to either grow the business or to be used for personal issues related to a home or housing or education or training. So it's a wonderful way for people to accumulate wealth that they may not have under other options. So how do we go about that? I'm going to go through these rather quickly. These are things that you can look at later. I think one of the biggest issues is that when we think about a vocational theme, we often try to look for businesses that represent work in that particular theme. And we try very hard to go right to the source quickly to find the #1 job that somebody could have. So I think here's an example of someone who might be have a construction theme, maybe that they like to work with tools, they have some skills in tools, they're really competent in doing construction and building things. And we might go to some of those home builders, people who are building and creating things, but just look at all the difficulties with that in terms of the high turnover. It can be seasonal, the work is not consistent. And so if we start to think a little differently and start to think up as what Carrie Griffin calls, we kind of job develop up the supply chain, we might look to lumber, hardware, wholesalers, and then looking at subcontract work, electrical, plumbing, home inspection, real estate, property management. Again, we don't need to know exactly what jobs there are initially. We need to go talk to people and by completing informational interviews, we get to know the people well and uncover opportunities for a variety of different kinds of outcomes, whether it be a small microenterprise that could be related to that business, or it could be resources that the employer might need. Another example, continuing that same example of looking at tools and rental repair, and where do people who want tools and who bring tools for repair or who wish to purchase tools, could be places from forestry to lumber mills to people who create other raw materials for growth and for construction, gardening, tree farms. There might be an accompanying agriculture theme. So looking at the ways in which we start to think about employment and the social connections that exist between these businesses is really critical. So think about self-employment options. Maybe there is a need to rent tools. Maybe there is a need for painting or subcontracting for particular businesses. We don't know until we go in and find. So resource ownership could always be an opportunity to enhance growth. It could be the other themes that the individual has in their lives could bring together two things. Maybe there would be a food theme along with a construction theme, and there could be a way to put those two together. Thinking about owning equipment. There was an example in Georgia where an individual with a developmental disability, through his resources, purchased a heavy piece of equipment, a front loader or a backhoe. And that individual rented that piece of equipment out to others, and he generated his income from the rental of that large piece of equipment. So kind of a quick summary is that we really need to think about how we build on our social capital and using community action teams, that we have to understand that our communities are very rich in those social connections, and we need to mine those connections. We need to spend time really getting to know those rich veins of community connections and get to know people well. We need to think about employment development is based on discovery, and that we have to use informational interviews to uncover employment opportunities, that we don't just go find jobs that exist, and that we have to use an economic development approach, that we have to change our focus from just wage employment and trying to carve out only the jobs that somebody can do without understanding its impact on the business, and to ensure that that's profitable. So thinking about that quick summary, we also know that we have to look at our communities differently. We have to get outside of our office and get outside of our traditional approaches to knocking on doors, looking for available jobs. We have to think more about economic development of our entire community, and making sure that we are seen as a piece of the puzzle and that we are seen as part of the economic development of our community. We have to spend more time with businesses and business owners. We have to spend more time getting to know them well. And we need to think about that disability doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's not just something that we experience or we see in our day services or our programs or our employment program, but it's part of our local economy. It's part of our community, and many cases our community is not aware that there is an economic development approach that could be of benefit to everyone. And I think we all have to have that positive and open approach to life, that we see possibility, that we aren't stumped by the lack of availability in our communities. A couple of resources for you all to be aware of. One is the Job Developers Handbook. Realizing that it's got a lot of these tools outlined for you and lots of resources. And then the other book is the second edition of the Making Self-Employment Work for People with Disabilities. We hope that you find these publications helpful to you. And if you have any questions, I hope we have a little bit of time left. Hopefully I'll be able to answer anything.
Thanks so much, Patty, for that wonderful presentation.
Might have, or comments.
Let's take a few moments to see if anybody has any questions. If you do, please type them in the chat box. Hey, well, I don't know that anybody has any questions. If you all like, we can follow up with if you think of something later. You're more than welcome to either email Patty or email myself, and I'll send it on to Patty, and we'll get your questions answered. Patty, thank you very much for your time and for all of your expertise that you've shared with us over the last couple of months. It's been really wonderful, and I know it's been very helpful for folks. If anybody would like to access this presentation, or any others, you can find them on the CCLC website under past presentations.